Have you ever noticed how, like, a political idea that seemed absolutely, completely crazy 10 years ago is suddenly a mainstream policy today?
Oh, yeah. It happens way more often than our historical memory likes to admit.
Right.
Yeah.
Think about it. You go back a decade, and some proposal is treated as a total joke. The media laughs at it, politicians run away from it, and if you brought it up at a dinner party, people would look at you like you had three heads.
Exactly. But then, almost invisibly, the ground shifts.
Yeah, the joke becomes a debate. The debate becomes a platform. And before you know it, that exact same crazy idea is being signed into law, and everyone acts like it was common sense all along.
We tend to view political change in retrospect as this, linear, rational progression. Like society just naturally matures from one good idea to the next.
It's not like that at all.
No, the reality is highly fluid. The boundaries of what a society considers normal or acceptable are constantly expanding, contracting, and being violently pushed in different directions.
And that invisible boundary, the literal force field that dictates what is politically acceptable at any given moment, actually has a name. It is called the Overton Window.
Or sometimes you'll hear it called the window of discourse.
Right. And today we're taking a massive deep dive into this exact concept. We are going to dissect what it is, how it functions mechanically, and most importantly, who is actually moving it.
Because once you see the architecture of this window, you cannot unsee it.
You really can't. You start seeing it in every news broadcast, every single election cycle, and every cultural debate you have.
It functions as the master key to understanding societal change. It clarifies why certain brilliant, well-researched ideas completely crash and burn, while terrible, destructive ideas can suddenly sweep the nation.
And before we get going, I want to quickly outline the stack of sources we've curated for you today. We're pulling foundational definitions from the MACKINAC Center for Public Policy and Wikipedia.
We also have a left-wing perspective via a Tokyo Foundation book review of Owen Jones's book, The Establishment.
And a right-wing realist perspective from a Japanese conservative encyclopedia called WIKIPIDIA. Plus, we've got some academic and social critiques from an Ask Social Science forum.
And just to pause right there for you, the listener, before we really get into the weeds, because this deep dive explores how political ideas become mainstream, our sources contain highly politically charged content featuring both strong left-wing and strong right-wing viewpoints.
Yeah, that's really important to note.
We want to be completely clear to you, the listener. We are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any of these viewpoints. Our mission is strictly to impartially report on the contents of these sources and help you understand the diverse arguments they present.
Exactly the lens we need. We're looking at the engine, not judging the destination. Our mission is to unpack not just what the Overton window is, but to explore the conflicting theories on who actually controls it and how it's manipulated to shape the society you live in.
So before we can understand how this window is weaponized by different political factions, we have to understand its basic blueprint.
Right. So where did this concept even originate? I've seen it thrown around on social media so much lately that it feels like an internet buzzword, but it actually has a very specific origin, right?
It does. The origin story takes us back to the mid-1990s. The term was developed by Joseph P. Overton, who was a senior vice president at the MACKINAC Center for Public Policy.
Which is a free market think tank based in Michigan.
Yes. And Overton had a very practical problem he was trying to solve. He needed to develop a conceptual model to explain to potential donors and the general public how a think tank actually generates a return on investment.
Because, he had to prove that influencing public policy isn't just about handing a lobbyist a briefcase of cash and sending them to a politician's office.
Right. He wanted to demonstrate that real, lasting policy change requires altering the entire climate of ideas that politicians operate within.
Because if a politician is just operating in a hostile climate, no amount of lobbying is going to make them commit political suicide by supporting an unpopular idea.
Exactly. Now, Overton unfortunately died in a plane crash in 2003, and he never actually published a definitive book on this.
So how did it become such a massive concept?
The concept was formalized and named in his honor by his colleague at the MACKINAC Center, Joseph Lehman. Lehman is the one who really brought the Overton window into the mainstream public discourse and defined its parameters.
And one of the most vital parameters, which I feel like almost everyone gets wrong when they first hear about this, is the axis it operates on.
Yeah, it's a huge misconception.
Because I always visualize political spectrums as a horizontal line. You have the left wing over on the left, the right wing on the right, and the moderates clustered in the middle. I just assumed the window slides left or right.
But Overton deliberately avoided that setup. He intentionally discarded the horizontal left-right spectrum because those labels carry immense historical baggage.
Oh, that makes sense.
And frankly, they lose their meaning depending on the era or the country you are analyzing. What is considered a conservative economic view in the US might be considered a liberal view in 19th century Europe. The labels just get messy.
So Overton designed his spectrum graphically on a vertical axis.
Yes. It ranged from more free at the top to less free at the bottom.
Free meaning the level of government intervention.
Specifically government intervention in a given policy area. For any specific issue, you map all possible policies on this vertical line.
Right.
At the absolute top, you have total individual freedom with zero government involvement. At the absolute bottom, you have total authoritarian government control, where the state dictates every single action.
And the Overton window is a designated segment somewhere on that vertical line.
Exactly. It doesn't cover the whole line. It only covers the subset of policies that the public currently finds acceptable.
You know, I always explain the Overton window to people using a restaurant analogy, and I think it perfectly illustrates Lehman's core thesis about how politicians behave.
Oh, the menu analogy. That's a good one.
Yeah. So imagine a politician walking into a restaurant. The restaurant is society, and the menu they are handed represents the Overton window.
Okay.
The menu has a few appetizers, a few entrees, maybe a couple of desserts. Those are the policies currently residing inside the window. The politician can order absolutely anything printed on that menu, and the waiter who represents the voting public will happily bring it to them.
Right. They can spend an hour debating whether the chicken or the fish is the superior choice.
Right.
But both are on the menu.
Exactly. Both are acceptable choices for a reasonable person to make. The conflict arises when they look past the menu.
Right, if they try to go off script.
If the politician suddenly demands a dish that isn't printed there, say, they demand a live octopus or a bowl of broken glass, the waiters is going to stare at them in horror.
And probably call security.
Yeah, if they start shouting and demanding the broken glass, the restaurant manager is going to physically throw them out into the street. In the political realm, getting thrown out of the restaurant means losing your primary election.
Losing your funding.
Having your campaign funding pulled by terrified donors and being relentlessly mocked by late-night talk show hosts, politicians desperately want to stay inside the restaurant because it's warm and they want to keep eating.
So they strictly limit themselves to ordering what is currently printed on the menu.
That analogy captures the fundamental, unbending rule of the Overton window, according to Joseph Lehman. Lawmakers do not move the window.
Right. They are entirely passive actors in this specific dynamic. They function as weather vanes.
A weather vane doesn't change the direction of the wind.
Exactly. It simply detects the current direction and aligns itself to minimize resistance. The political viability of any idea depends almost entirely on whether it falls within that acceptable range, rather than on the individual private preferences of the politician.
A senator might secretly deeply believe that the bowl of broken glass is actually a greatest policy ever conceived.
But they possess the survival instinct to know that proposing it out loud will end their career.
Now, we'll circle back to that weather vane idea because I have some major questions about whether politicians are truly that passive. But first, let's break down the interior of the window.
Yeah, because it's not just a binary switch where an idea is either acceptable or insane. There's a gradation to it.
Our sources pull a framework from a political commentator named Joshua Trevino, who mapped out 6 specific degrees of acceptance for public ideas.
You can visualize this as a progression scale. It starts from the wild fringes of society, slowly creeps toward the boundary of the window, crosses the threshold, and eventually lands dead center in the mainstream.
And the 6 stages are unthinkable, radical, acceptable, sensible, popular, and finally, policy.
We'll walk an idea through those stages so we can see the mechanics in action. Stage 1 is unthinkable.
In the unthinkable stage, the vast majority of the population cannot even fathom the idea as a legitimate topic for serious discussion, right?
Right. If you stand on a soapbox and suggest an unthinkable policy, society doesn't even bother debating you. They simply dismiss you as a fringe lunatic. The idea violates the foundational norms of the culture.
But if the window starts to drift, that idea might upgrade to radical, which feels slightly different.
It is. If you're radical, people might still hate the idea, but they understand it's a political position. You are viewed as an extremist, maybe a dangerous one, but you are no longer just a random person yelling at clouds.
The mainstream vigorously rejects your premise, but they are at least acknowledging the premise exists.
And the critical moment happens in the transition from radical to the third stage, acceptable.
This is the moment the idea breaches the outer boundary of the Overton window.
Exactly. It is now on the restaurant menu.
Yeah.
You might personally despise the idea, but you concede that it is a legitimate topic for a public forum. You wouldn't demand a politician resign simply for discussing it.
Then it moves to sensible. The taboo is completely gone. Pundits on Sunday morning news shows stroke their chins and call it a pragmatic approach.
It's treated as a serious, viable, intellectual option, which naturally leads to the popular stage.
Where the idea isn't just sensible to policy wonks in Washington, but it has secured widespread, enthusiastic public support.
The average voter likes it. Politicians flock to popular ideas because adopting them is a guaranteed way to secure votes and positive press coverage.
And the final destination is policy. The idea is drafted, voted on, and written into the legal code. It becomes the new status quo.
And once an idea cements itself as policy, it often becomes the new gravitational center of the window, forcing older policies to slide backward into the acceptable or even radical stages.
The MACKINAC Center source provides a very clean illustration of this using education policy.
Yeah, let's apply Overton's vertical axis to that. At the very top extreme, representing maximum freedom and zero government intervention, you have a policy where public schools do not exist.
Education is entirely a private matter.
Right. No state funding, no mandatory attendance laws, no regulations on what parents teach at home. Then at the absolute bottom, extreme, representing total government control, private schools and homeschooling are strictly outlawed by the federal government.
And every child is mandated to attend a state-run, federally controlled academy.
Exactly. Now, in most modern Western democracies, both of those extremes reside firmly in the unthinkable or radical stages.
Yeah, if a mainstream presidential candidate stood at a debate podium and declared, "I am going to bulldoze every public school and let the free market handle all education,"
or conversely, "I'm making it a felony to teach your child at home,"
their campaign would be over by morning. The window currently sits comfortably in the middle. The menu items include tax-funded public school districts, charter schools, and heavily regulated private and homeschooling.
Politicians will scream at each other over the exact funding ratio of charter schools versus public schools, but that entire screaming match takes place within a very narrow, predefined boundary of acceptability.
You see a similar but temporal shift with the concept of alcohol prohibition in the United States.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
In the 1920s, a complete federal ban on the production and sale of alcohol wasn't just popular, it was the policy. It was enshrined in the Constitution. It was the dead center of the Overton window.
But fast forward 100 years. If a modern politician ran on a platform of reinstating the 18th Amendment and bringing back federal prohibition, they would be universally viewed as a crank.
It's completely unthinkable today. The window didn't just shift slightly. It packed up its bags, moved to a different state, and left prohibition to rot on the fringe.
Right.
But this brings me to my major point of pushback against Joseph Lehman's theory.
The weather vane idea.
Yes. Lehman insists politicians are just weather vanes. They passively read the menu. But if the politicians aren't turning the dial and shifting the window from prohibition to legalization, who is?
That's the big question.
Society doesn't just magically evolve in a vacuum. Ideas don't spontaneously generate momentum. Someone has to be paying for the marketing, writing the arguments, and actively shoving these concepts from unthinkable to policy.
That transitions us perfectly from the anatomy of the window into the actual mechanics of movement. Lehman argued that the window is shaped by ideas, social movements, and shared cultural norms. But you are absolutely correct to ask how those norms are deliberately manipulated.
Because it is rarely an organic accident.
No. There are highly specialized actors and psychological mechanisms designed specifically to drag ideas across those 6 stages of acceptance.
So who are the invisible hands turning the dial? Let's get into the mechanics.
A phenomenal framework for understanding this comes from the economist Friedrich Hayek, which is highlighted in the right-wing realist source we reviewed from WIKIPIDIA. Hayek developed a concept he called the second-hand dealers in ideas.
Second-hand dealers in ideas. That implies there are primary creators and then a whole class of people who act like intellectual pawn shops reselling the concepts.
That is essentially the dynamic. Hayek argued that true, original, paradigm-shifting ideas are usually generated by a tiny fraction of society. You know, deep-thinking philosophers, obscure economists, or visionary academics.
But these primary creators have a major problem. They usually lack direct access to the general public or to lawmakers.
Furthermore, their original texts are often incredibly dense, abstract, and completely unpalatable to a mainstream audience. I mean, if you hand a 500-page treatise on macroeconomic theory to a busy voter, they're going to throw it in the trash.
Right, they need a translator. They need a middleman who knows how to market.
And those middlemen are the secondhand dealers. We're talking about think tanks, policy analysts, journalists, public intellectuals, and university professors.
So their specific societal function is to take those raw, radical, unthinkable ideas, scrub off the rough edges, wrap them in a veneer of academic legitimacy and pragmatic language, and resell them to the public through easily digestible formats.
Yes. They write the op-eds, they produce the 3-minute explainer videos, they draft the executive summaries for politicians.
They are the ones putting the nice suit on the crazy idea so it can walk into the restaurant without getting kicked out.
And it requires relentless repetition. A think tank doesn't just publish one paper. They publish 50 papers over 10 years. They host annual conferences. They feed talking points to friendly podcasters and cable news anchors.
And through sheer grinding repetition, the idea slowly sheds its unthinkable status. People get used to hearing about it. It becomes radical, then acceptable, then sensible.
This connects deeply to the mechanism of media filtration, which brings us to the sociological critique drawn from the work of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, specifically their concepts of manufacturing consent.
Chomsky argues that the mass media is the ultimate gatekeeper of the Overton window. But he doesn't say the media sits around a smoky boardroom explicitly telling people what to think. It's more sophisticated than that.
The media tells people what to think about.
Exactly the distinction.
Chomsky's thesis suggests that the true power of the media ecosystem lies in its ability to define the borders of acceptable debate. He famously noted that the most effective way to maintain a system of control is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but to encourage incredibly vigorous, heated debate within that spectrum.
It creates a brilliant illusion of freedom. You turn on a cable news network and you see two pundits absolutely screaming at each other, faces turning red, seemingly holding diametrically opposed worldviews.
Right. The viewer feels like they are witnessing a robust democratic clash of all possible ideas.
But if you analyze the subtext, both of those screaming pundits actually agree on 90% of the underlying structural assumptions. They're arguing over the final 10%. They're arguing about the color of the curtains while the house is burning down.
Any perspective that fundamentally challenges the structural integrity of the house, any information that is truly disruptive to the corporate status quo, is simply filtered out.
It isn't necessarily suppressed by a mustache-twirling censor, right?
No, it just isn't deemed newsworthy or serious by the producers. The producers are naturally constrained by their reliance on advertising revenue from major corporations and their reliance on access to official government sources.
Because if a journalist starts promoting ideas too far outside the Overton window, they lose their access to those vital sources and they get pushed out of the industry.
So the media ecosystem naturally curates the menu, normalizing ideas by granting them airtime and marginalizing radical ideas by simply ignoring their existence.
Now, aside from think tanks and media filters, there are also direct psychological tactics used to yank the window. One of the most effective is something called the anchoring effect, or the door-in-the-face technique.
Oh, this one is fascinating. The anchoring effect is a cognitive bias where human beings rely too heavily on the first piece of information offered the anchor when making subsequent decisions.
And in political strategy, it is a devastatingly effective tool for manipulation.
It involves intentionally introducing a wildly extreme, often absurd policy proposal to deliberately skew the public's perception of what constitutes a reasonable compromise.
Think about negotiating a raise at your job. Let's say you know your market value dictates you deserve a 15% raise. But if you walk into your boss's office and lead with 15%, your boss's baseline is 0. So 15% feels like a massive radical leap. They will instinctively want to negotiate you down to 5%.
Right, so to utilize the anchoring effect, you change the initial baseline.
Or walk into the office, look your boss dead in the eye, and demand a 50% raise.
Wow.
Yeah. You establish an unthinkable anchor. Your boss reacts with absolute shock. They tell you you've lost your mind.
Obviously.
You let the tension sit there, you let them hyperventilate for a minute, and then you sigh and say, look, I understand the macroeconomic environment is tough right now. Let's be reasonable. Let's compromise at 15%.
And suddenly, compared to the terrifying specter of a 50% payroll increase, 15% looks incredibly sensible.
It looks like a bargain. You didn't convince them that 15% was intrinsically good. You just altered the surrounding context to make it look moderate.
Political factions use this relentlessly. A fringe group will demand the total, absolute abolition of a government agency, knowing full well they don't have the votes to achieve it.
But by dominating the news cycle with that extreme demand, they drag the center of the Overton window in their direction.
Suddenly, a policy to merely slash that agency's budget by 30%, which would have seemed radical yesterday, now appears to be the moderate, pragmatic compromise. They sacrifice the unthinkable anchor to secure the radical policy.
It explains the rise of so much extreme rhetoric today. The extremism isn't necessarily the goal, it's the tactical mechanism used to drag the center.
Yes.
But everything we've talked about so far, think tanks, media curation, anchoring these are slow, methodical processes. It takes years, sometimes decades, to pick the lock on the window. But there is a mechanism that can shatter the window overnight.
And that is the power of a systemic crisis. The WIKIPIDIA source connects the Overton window to Naomi Klein's concept of the shock doctrine.
The shock doctrine argues that when a massive exogenous shock hits a society, a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, a sudden economic collapse, the normal, slow-moving rules of political physics are instantly suspended.
The window becomes incredibly elastic, almost gelatinous.
Because during periods of stability, human beings possess strong psychological defenses.
We are deeply attached to the status quo because it represents safety and predictability. Moving the window requires overcoming that deep-seated inertia, but a crisis shatters that inertia.
When the public is profoundly frightened, disoriented, and desperate for a return to physical or economic safety, they will rapidly accept and even demand policies that just weeks prior would have been universally condemned as unthinkable.
The sources outline some incredibly stark, undeniable examples of this phenomenon. Look at the aftermath of the September 11th attacks in the U.S.
Before 9/11, if you had proposed the creation of a massive, opaque, new federal bureaucracy like the Department of Homeland Security,
or suggested implementing sweeping, warrantless surveillance on the domestic communications of ordinary citizens,
you would have been laughed out of Washington. It would have been viewed as a dystopian, radical violation of civil liberties.
Yet, following the visceral shock of the attacks, the Patriot Act was drafted, introduced, and passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in a matter of weeks.
The unthinkable became policy almost instantly.
The crisis created a vacuum, and the public, traumatized by the event, was entirely willing to trade their long-held privacy for the promise of immediate security. The window didn't just shift, it was blown wide open.
Or consider the 2008 global financial crash. If a politician in 2006 had suggested taking trillions of taxpayer dollars and handing it directly to the largest, most reckless private banks on Wall Street, it would have been political suicide. The public would have rioted.
But when the crisis reached its zenith, and the narrative became that the entire global network of ATMs would cease functioning within 48 hours, bank bailouts instantly shifted from unthinkable to the only sensible option on the menu.
And we witnessed this on an even grander global scale with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, absolutely. In early 2019, if a Western government announced a plan to legally mandate the indefinite closure of millions of non-essential businesses,
confine healthy, asymptomatic citizens to their private residences for months,
and require digital proof of vaccination to enter a grocery store or a restaurant, the public would have dismissed it as authoritarian fiction. It was completely outside the Overton window of liberal democracies.
But by the spring of 2020, those exact policies became the synchronized global standard.
The sheer terror of the biological crisis allowed the window to shift at light speed.
And this mechanism brings us to a chilling observation made by the economist Milton Friedman, which perfectly synthesizes the relationship between crisis and the secondhand dealers we discussed earlier.
Friedman wrote, "Only a crisis actual or perceived produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around."
The ideas that are lying around, that is the key phrase.
It explains the true purpose of the think tanks. The intellectuals and analysts don't just write white papers in the hope of slowly moving public opinion. They write those papers to ensure that when a crisis inevitably strikes, their specific, radical ideas are already drafted.
Legally polished, bound in a neat folder, and sitting on a desk ready to be deployed.
Exactly. They know they can't pass the legislation today. They're simply preparing the ideas so that they're the ones lying around when the shock shatters the window and the politicians are frantically searching for solutions.
I want to turn to you, the listener, for a second. Think about a recent crisis you've lived through. It doesn't have to be a massive global pandemic. Maybe it was a severe local natural disaster, a sudden shift in your industry's economy, or a major social upheaval in your city.
What impossible rules, what entirely unthinkable policies suddenly became the rigid new normal overnight?
And more importantly, if you trace those new rules backward, whose ideas were lying around waiting to be implemented, it's a deeply sobering thought exercise. It makes you realize that our shared concept of normalcy isn't a permanent structure, it's just a temporary consensus waiting for the next shock.
It really reveals the profound fragility of the status quo.
Okay, so we've established the mechanics. We know the window is moved by think tanks translating academic theory, by media networks filtering out disruptive ideas, by tactical anchoring, and by the explosive force of systemic crises.
Right.
But this naturally leads to a much darker question of motivation and funding. Who is paying the salaries of these think tanks? Who owns the media conglomerates that filter the ideas?
This brings us to the left-wing critique of the Overton Window, specifically analyzing Owen Jones's book, The Establishment, which we explored via a review from the Tokyo Foundation.
Owen Jones presents a compelling and aggressive thesis. He argues that the Overton Window is not some organic manifestation of democratic will, floating around in a neutral, free market of ideas.
No, he posits that the window is being actively, deliberately, and aggressively managed by an elite, wealthy class, which he terms the establishment, to ruthlessly protect their financial interests and consolidate their power, entirely at the expense of the working and middle classes.
And he identifies a specific group driving this. The review calls it the vanguard of neoliberalism. When he says vanguard, he doesn't mean a grassroots movement. He means a heavily funded, highly coordinated network.
The vanguard, in Jones's framework, consists of free market economists, high-powered public relations firms, heavily endowed corporate think tanks, and media moguls.
According to his analysis, this vanguard hasn't just been trying to win a few election cycles.
Over the last 4 decades, they have executed a brilliantly successful, comprehensive ideological campaign. Their ultimate objective was to fundamentally alter the structural framing of the Overton Window so that deregulated free market capitalism is no longer viewed as one political choice among many, but rather as an immutable law of nature.
They don't just want their ideas to be popular, they want them to be the basic operating system of reality, the new normal.
Exactly. The vanguard seeks to create a pervasive cultural atmosphere built on the concept of TINA, an acronym for There Is No Alternative.
Tina? Anna.
Yeah. If you can successfully convince the populace that there is simply no viable alternative to the current economic structure, you never have to win another policy debate.
Any alternative economic model, whether it's democratic socialism, heavy state intervention, or robust wealth redistribution, doesn't even get to the debate stage. It falls completely outside the Overton Window into the unthinkable realm, dismissed as utopian fantasy or economic suicide. But the most fascinating part of Jones's critique, the part I really want to unpack, is the massive, glaring hypocrisy at the center of the establishment's ideology.
The double standard.
Yes. He argues that this vanguard has successfully engineered a system defined by socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor.
It is a devastatingly effective phrase, and it highlights a structural paradox. The establishment narrative preaches fierce, unforgiving free market discipline and rugged individualism for everyday citizens.
Right. If a regular person loses their job due to downsizing or goes bankrupt because of a medical emergency, the establishment consensus dictates that they must endure the harsh realities of the market. They need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, retrain, and adapt.
State intervention or robust welfare programs are framed as dangerous because they create dependency and distort the elegant efficiency of the free market.
But when you look at how the elites actually operate, they don't practice free market capitalism at all. They rely massively on the state to protect and subsidize their wealth. They are entirely dependent on the very government intervention they tell the poor to abhor.
The book provides several stark structural examples of this hypocrisy in action. We already touched on the 2008 bank bailouts in the context of the shock doctrine, but Jones views it as the ultimate expression of this double standard.
He calls it the ultimate subsidy.
The executives and financial institutions that crashed the global economy through objectively reckless speculation and complex derivatives trading did not face the ruthless discipline of the free market they claimed to champion. When their gambles failed, they weren't allowed to go bankrupt.
The state rushed in with trillions in public taxpayer money to socialize their massive losses, and in many infamous cases, those same executives still walked away with multi-million-dollar bonuses derived from the bailout funds.
The risk was entirely socialized, while the profit remained fiercely privatized.
And the review also points to the privatization of railways in the UK as a prime, ongoing example.
These critical public infrastructure assets were sold off to private corporations under the ideological promise that the free market would introduce efficiency and lower costs.
But what actually happened is a masterclass in risk shifting. The private companies took control of the revenue streams. When the railways generate a profit, those profits are immediately funneled out as dividends to private shareholders.
But when the aging infrastructure inevitably crumbles and requires a multi-billion-dollar upgrade,
Or when a franchise completely fails to provide adequate service and faces bankruptcy.
the private company doesn't absorb the loss. They threaten to collapse the transit system, forcing the state, meaning the taxpayer, to step in with massive public subsidies to bail them out and fix the tracks.
It creates a no-lose scenario for the establishment. You see the same mechanism in the nuclear energy sector.
The source notes that the state intentionally caps the liability for private nuclear energy companies in the event of a disaster.
So if a catastrophic meltdown occurs, the private corporation is only legally required to pay damages up to a specific, manageable limit.
And the state is on the hook for the rest of the apocalyptic cleanup costs, which can run into the hundreds of billions.
Unbelievable.
By legally capping their liability, the state artificially lowers the insurance premiums for these corporations. If they had to purchase insurance on the free market to cover the true total cost of a potential nuclear disaster, the industry would be entirely unprofitable.
The liability cap is a...
And Jones argues that this double standard isn't just an economic quirk. It is baked deeply into the legal system and how society perceives crime. The treatment of the Big Four accounting firms is a perfect illustration of this.
Let's talk about the Big Four.
The Big Four accounting firms represent a crucial node in the establishment network. They are intimately involved in the drafting of complex tax legislation for governments worldwide. They literally help write the laws.
And then, utilizing that insider knowledge, they turn around and advise their massive multinational corporate clients on exactly how to exploit the intricate loopholes they just helped weave into the legislation.
This practice facilitates the evasion of billions of dollars in tax revenue that should have gone to public services. But notice how it is framed inside the Overton window.
The media and the political class refer to this as clever tax planning or fiduciary responsibility, or utilizing legal frameworks.
It is treated as a sophisticated, necessary, and completely respectable business strategy.
But contrast that framing with how the system treats welfare recipients.
Right. If a working-class individual makes an error on a complex welfare application or improperly receives a few $100s in excess benefits, the response is entirely different.
They are aggressively targeted by tabloid media campaigns, branded as welfare cheats and parasites draining the productive economy, and they face the full punitive force of state prosecution and potential imprisonment.
It reveals that there are two entirely different Overton windows operating simultaneously, depending on your net worth. The state's monopoly on violence and coercion is deployed to protect this bifurcated system.
The review notes Jones's observation that the police force has increasingly been transformed from a community service organization into a paramilitary force primarily tasked with suppressing anti-establishment protests and protecting corporate property.
The irony, of course, is that even the police are beginning to face the threat of privatization from the very elite class they are paid to protect.
So the ultimate psychological goal of this establishment vanguard, according to Jones, isn't just wealth accumulation.
It's the cultivation of a profound sense of resignation among the general public.
If you can convince the populace that the system is completely rigged, but simultaneously convince them that it is entirely impossible to change, they will start fighting. They will accept their diminishing quality of life as a tragic but unalterable law of nature, remaining docile within the carefully curated boundaries of the window.
So what is his prescription? If the vanguard has unlimited money and controls the media, how does Jones suggest people fight back?
His solution is that the left, or any genuine anti-establishment movement, must stop trying to politely debate within the current window and instead build a coherent, persuasive, and equally organized counter-narrative.
They must construct their own vanguard.
Yes. They have to violently yank the Overton window away from the elites by presenting a viable, hopeful alternative that directly addresses the material conditions of everyday people, replacing resignation with political mobilization.
Okay, I find Jones's diagnosis incredibly compelling, but I have to play devil's advocate on his core premise.
Let's hear it.
He paints the establishment as this monolithic, perfectly unified cabal sitting in a room, rubbing their hands together, operating with a single hive mind. But are the elites really that unified?
Right. If you look closely, there are massive, bitter fractures within the upper echelons of power.
Exactly. The agenda of a Silicon Valley tech billionaire is often diametrically opposed to the agenda of a Texas oil baron or a Wall Street hedge fund manager. They fight viciously over policy and regulation.
That is the most common and potent critique of Jones's framework. The elite class is rarely as monolithic or perfectly coordinated as populist narratives both left and right suggest.
They share a general interest in capital preservation, but their specific mechanisms for achieving it often put them in direct destructive conflict with one another.
Furthermore, if Jones's mechanics are correct, it leads to a very depressing conclusion for grassroots democracy.
How so?
Well, if the window can only truly be moved by a heavily funded vanguard utilizing high-powered PR firms and think tanks, does that mean any movement trying to help everyday people is doomed to fail unless they can somehow convince a few sympathetic billionaires to bankroll their own counter-vanguard? It makes it seem like ordinary citizens have zero agency.
It forces a difficult reckoning with the mechanics of modern political power. If the primary tools required to shift the Overton window institutional think tanks, mass media ownership, and sustained multi-million-dollar PR campaigns are inherently tied to massive capital accumulation, then reclaiming the window becomes an incredibly steep, perhaps insurmountable uphill battle for movements built purely on grassroots enthusiasm.
Which provides the perfect pivot to our next perspective. Because while the left argues the window is controlled by wealthy elites pulling strings behind the curtain, the conservative, realist perspective from our WIKIPIDIA source offers a radically different theory of agency.
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting. They argue that the window isn't just slowly manipulated by think tanks over decades. They argue that bold, individual politicians possess the power and the historical duty to smash the window themselves.
This perspective is a direct, aggressive rejection of Joseph Lehman's foundational rule. Remember, Lehman insisted that politicians are merely weather vanes. They only detect the wind, they never generate it.
The realist analysis fundamentally disagrees with that premise.
They argue that a politician who simply acts as a weather vane, who just reads the menu and orders the most popular appetizer to keep their approval ratings high, isn't a political leader at all.
They are merely an administrator, a bureaucrat masquerading as a visionary.
According to this view, true historical leadership is defined exclusively by a politician's ability to force the Overton window to move against its will.
The true leader steps outside the comfortable boundaries of the acceptable, absorbs the intense, coordinated attacks from the media and the establishment, and through sheer force of will, unyielding repetition, and personal charisma, physically drags public opinion to where they have planted their flag.
They don't wait for the wind to change, they become the hurricane. Who are these window smashers? The source provides some fascinating historical case studies. Let's look at Charles de Gaulle.
Charles de Gaulle's actions in the 1960s serve as a textbook example of a leader operating entirely outside the accepted window.
At the time, the Cold War was at its absolute peak.
For a Western European nation, the only sensible mainstream policy, the only item on the geopolitical menu, was to remain firmly integrated into the NATO military command structure and remain safely sheltered beneath the nuclear umbrella of the United States. To suggest otherwise was considered reckless endangerment of the free world.
But de Gaulle looked at the menu and threw it out.
He did. In 1966, de Gaulle made the stunning decision to abruptly withdraw France from NATO's integrated military command. He demanded that all U.S. and NATO military personnel vacate French soil.
Wow.
Furthermore, he aggressively funded and accelerated an independent French nuclear weapons program, the Force de Frappe, refusing to rely on American deterrence.
The blowback must have been insane.
The American and British establishments were apoplectic. They viewed his actions as incredibly radical, perhaps even unhinged. They believed it was entirely unthinkable for a core ally to fracture the unified front of the Western Bloc during a standoff with the Soviet Union.
But de Gaulle didn't care about what was considered acceptable in the halls of Washington or London. He recognized that the window in France needed to change.
Through sheer obstinance and nationalist appeal, He forced the French Overton Window to shift drastically from subservient reliance on American protection to a new baseline of national independence, self-reliance, and strategic autonomy.
He didn't pick the lock, he broke the door down.
We see another compelling example of this methodology in the actions of Mahathir Mohamad, who was the Prime Minister of Malaysia during the devastating 1997 Asian financial crisis.
The Asian financial crisis was brutal. Entire economies were melting down overnight, and the International Monetary Fund immediately flew in with their standard unbending playbook.
When the crisis triggered massive capital flight and currency collapses, the IMF, acting as the ultimate enforcer of the global neoliberal establishment, dictated that the only sensible policy response was severe structural adjustment.
They demanded that affected nations implement harsh austerity measures, dramatically hike interest rates, slash public spending, and completely open their financial markets to foreign capital.
They essentially said, take this incredibly painful medicine or your economy dies. And most countries like Thailand and South Korea accepted the medicine, believing they had no other choice. The IMF playbook was the entire Overton window for macroeconomic crisis management.
But Mahathir Mohamad categorically rejected the premise.
He refused the IMF's loans and entirely ignored their structural demands. Instead, he implemented policies that were considered economic heresy at the time.
He instituted strict capital controls, aggressively pegging the Malaysian ringgit to the US dollar and legally restricting the ability of investors to pull foreign capital out of the country.
The global financial press lost its collective mind. International economists and Western media networks screamed that this was a radical, disastrous, economically illiterate move that would turn Malaysia into an isolated pariah state and destroy its economy for a generation.
Yet, the empirical results defied the consensus. Malaysia recovered from the crisis significantly faster and with far less social and economic devastation than the neighboring countries that had obediently swallowed the IMF medicine.
Mahathir stood entirely outside the Overton window of acceptable global economics, absorbed the relentless attacks from the international establishment, and proved that a supposedly unthinkable policy was actually the correct mechanism to save his nation.
The WIKIPIDIA source brings this concept directly into the modern era, focusing on right-wing populist leaders who utilize this exact window-smashing strategy today. They specifically point to Donald Trump in the United States and Viktor Orban in Hungary.
Regardless of one's personal, moral, or political assessment of their policies, analytically speaking, both leaders operate as classic window movers. They completely discard the weather vane model.
They intentionally deploy rhetoric and policy proposals that are immediately classified by the legacy media and the political establishment as unthinkable, radical, or deeply offensive.
Think back to the launch of Trump's 2015 campaign. He proposed building a massive physical wall across the entire southern border, implementing strict, targeted immigration bans, unilaterally ripping up decades-old free trade agreements like NAFTA, and launching aggressive tariff wars against China.
At that exact moment in 2015, the establishment consensus of both the Republican and Democratic parties viewed those ideas as completely beyond the pale. They were considered fringe, unviable, and politically toxic.
But Trump understood the mechanics of the window. By relentlessly repeating these ideas at massive rallies, and crucially, by weathering the ensuing media firestorms without backing down, apologizing, or moderating his tone, he created a new gravitational pull.
He dragged those fringe issues directly into the center of the Republican Party platform.
Through sheer repetition, defiance, and political survival, he forced ideas that were deemed unthinkable in 2014 into the realm of rational and widely popular policy for half the American electorate by 2016.
Viktor Orban executed a very similar maneuver in Europe regarding immigration quotas and national sovereignty, implementing hardline policies that the European Union leadership declared fundamentally unacceptable, yet maintaining domestic power and slowly shifting the discourse of neighboring conservative parties across the continent.
This analysis opens up a broader discussion about how wildly and how rapidly the Overton window has swung in Western democracies over recent decades. The source tracks several dramatic historical shifts that prove the window is far more elastic than we assume.
Let's examine the history of U.S. immigration policy. This is a perfect example of the window swinging back and forth like a giant pendulum.
If you go back a century to 1924, the United States passed the Johnson-Reed Act. This legislation implemented incredibly strict national origins quotas.
It severely restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and it outright banned almost all immigration from Asia. At that moment in history, harsh restrictionism wasn't just popular, it was the bipartisan policy. It was the dead center of the window.
But over the subsequent 40 years, the demographic and cultural wind shifted dramatically. By 1965, the Hart-Celler Act was passed, completely abolishing those race-based quotas.
The window had moved to embrace a much more open, diversity-focused, and economically driven immigration system.
For decades following that act, the general consensus among the leadership of both major political parties was generally in favor of maintaining high legal immigration levels and eventually providing paths to legalization for undocumented immigrants. The idea of drastically slashing legal immigration or engaging in militarized mass deportations was considered a radical fringe position.
But then, as we just discussed with the populist movement, the window swung violently backward in the late 2010s. Proposals that would have disqualified a candidate in 2012 became the standard foundational party platform by 2024. The unthinkable became sensible again.
We can observe a similarly massive reversal in the realms of U.S. foreign policy and economic theory.
Following World War II and accelerating rapidly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the American Overton window was firmly locked on global interventionism and neoliberal economics.
The unquestionable consensus was that the United States must act as the indispensable world policeman, maintaining a vast, expensive network of global military alliances, while aggressively championing unfettered free trade, globalization, and corporate deregulation.
But if you look at the discourse today, that consensus is crumbling. The window has shifted heavily back toward economic nationalism, protectionism, and a modern form of foreign policy isolationism.
The text specifically highlights the dramatic pivot on industrial policy. For decades, American diplomats and economists lectured the rest of the developing world, especially rising economies like Japan and South Korea, that government-directed industrial policy and state subsidies were inherently inefficient, corrupt, and wrong.
The rigid rule was that the free market must decide where factories are built. Do as we say, open your markets to our corporations and stop subsidizing your own.
Exactly. But recently, when the United States suddenly found itself facing intense geopolitical competition from China and realized its critical supply chains were vulnerable, the window shifted instantly.
The U.S. Congress passed the CHIPS Act, explicitly pouring billions of dollars in state subsidies into domestic semiconductor manufacturing to guarantee supply.
Which is the textbook definition of heavy-handed government industrial policy. What the United States previously lectured the world was unthinkable or bad economics, instantaneously became sensible and essential policy the moment it served American national security interests.
It exposes a certain hypocrisy, demonstrating that the Overton window on a global scale is often dictated by raw power dynamics and self-interest, rather than pure, unyielding ideology.
And it's not just America. The source notes that Europe is currently experiencing its own massive structural window shifts.
For a very long time, unquestioned multiculturalism was the dominant, unassailable paradigm in Western Europe, a legacy originating with the guest worker programs of the post-war era aimed at rebuilding the continent.
To openly criticize the integration process of immigrants or to question the cultural impact of demographic changes was a massive political taboo. It placed a politician firmly in the radical or unthinkable zone, often resulting in immediate ostracization.
But that specific window has shattered. You had centrist leaders like Angela Merkel in Germany publicly stating that the project of multiculturalism had utterly failed.
The deep-seated taboo against nationalism was spectacularly broken by the Brexit vote, where the British public chose an outcome that the entire combined financial and political establishment had explicitly warned them was unthinkable economic suicide.
Perhaps the most staggering shift occurred overnight in European security policy. For decades following World War II, Germany's Overton window was deeply anchored in strict pacifism, military restraint, and reliance on economic integration with Russia.
But the moment Russian tanks crossed the border into Ukraine, that window vanished into thin air.
Almost overnight, the profound historical taboo against German rearmament was broken. The Chancellor announced a massive, unprecedented increase in military spending.
It was the shock doctrine operating in real time, moving a deeply entrenched cultural window in a matter of hours rather than decades.
I want to offer an analogy to contrast this right-wing realist view of the populist politician with the think tank mechanics we discussed earlier. If the think tanks and the secondhand dealers in ideas are like highly trained, sophisticated thieves trying to pick a complex lock over many years, gently manipulating the tumblers of public opinion, publishing white papers, waiting for the door to slowly click open, These populist leaders are fundamentally different.
They are a battering ram.
A battering ram. Let's expand on the mechanics of that image. A populist leader doesn't have the patience to pick the lock.
They don't employ academics to write 50-page white papers on the sociological benefits of opening the door.
They just pick up a massive heavy log and violently smash it repeatedly into the door. Now, they take an immense amount of damage doing this. They get splintered by the media. They face massive institutional backlash. They are called every name in the book.
But that's actually the psychological mechanism at play.
By absorbing all that outrage, they act as a lightning rod. They exhaust the media's outrage machine. The media spends 2 weeks screaming that the politician is insane for hitting the door. But eventually, the media runs out of breath.
The public gets bored of the outrage. And if the politician hits the door hard enough and long enough, the door eventually breaks off its hinges.
And once the door is broken, the architecture of the room is permanently altered.
Exactly. The lockpickers are left standing there, stunned, holding their delicate tools, realizing they don't need them anymore because the wall is gone.
The unthinkable idea is now just sitting there in the middle of the room, completely normalized, not because it was intellectually proven, but because the taboo protecting it was physically destroyed through attrition.
It perfectly encapsulates the difference in methodology. The vanguard of think tanks seeks to quietly, intellectually shift the window while no one is looking. The populist leader seeks to loudly shatter it, redefining the boundaries through sheer force of personality, confrontation, and the exhaustion of their opponents.
So we've explored how the window moves wildly in the US and Europe. We've seen it meticulously picked by think tanks, and we've seen it violently smashed by populists. But this brings us to our final source, and it raises perhaps the most chilling, profound question of this entire deep dive.
What happens when a country's Overton window isn't moving at all? What happens when the window is installed, locked, and nailed shut by an occupying foreign power?
This represents the core analytical thesis of the Hoshipedia text regarding the political reality of Japan.
The text argues forcefully that to truly understand Japanese domestic politics, you cannot simply look at local public opinion polling or the platforms of domestic political parties.
You have to recognize a foundational structural reality. The initial settings of Japan's post-war Overton window were not chosen organically by the Japanese people.
They were engineered and installed by the United States occupation forces in the immediate aftermath of World War II.
They didn't just help rebuild the house. They built the house, installed the windows facing the direction they preferred, locked them, and then handed over the keys.
Precisely. The architecture of this installed window rests on two massive, immovable pillars. The first is the Japanese Constitution, which was drafted primarily by American military occupation staff in a matter of days. The second is the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty.
These two foundational documents dictate the rigid boundaries of what is considered politically acceptable discourse in modern Japan.
And according to the source, this installed window isn't just a relic of the 1940s. It isn't a historical artifact. It is an active, ongoing project maintained today by a powerful network of U.S. experts, diplomats, military officials, and allied Japanese policymakers, often referred to in political circles as Japan handlers.
Their primary unspoken objective is to ensure that the Japanese Overton window never shifts in a direction that would compromise U.S. strategic hegemony in the Pacific theater.
Because of this externally installed window, policies that are considered entirely sensible, routine, or even foundational to national sovereignty in other democratic nations have been kept forcefully suppressed in the unthinkable or radical categories in Japan for over 7 decades.
Give us some concrete examples of what is considered an unthinkable option on this restricted menu.
In the context of the Hoshipedia analysis, it has been practically unthinkable for a mainstream Japanese politician to advocate for possessing a fully independent, unconstrained offensive military force capable of power projection.
Wow.
It is entirely unthinkable to advocate for acquiring an independent nuclear deterrent, despite the fact that Japan possesses the advanced technological capability to build one in months and exists in a highly volatile region surrounded by hostile nuclear-armed neighbors like North Korea and China.
And perhaps most significantly, it is considered dangerously radical to suggest asking the United States military to vacate its numerous bases on Japanese soil and terminate the security treaty.
In literally any other major sovereign country on Earth, debating the continued presence of foreign troops on your soil would be a normal, sensible part of the political discourse. It would be debated in every election.
But in Japan, it's completely off the menu. The window is permanently anchored in a state of strategic dependency. To suggest independence is to suggest a radical, destabilizing upheaval of the entire political order.
But the window has shifted slightly in Japan over the last decade, hasn't it? I recall reading about changes to their defense posture. But it seems to happen through incredibly subtle stealth maneuvering rather than battering rams.
Yes, the source highlights a fascinating dynamic. Because Japanese leaders cannot smash the window without facing intense, coordinated backlash from both the domestic media establishment and the foreign hegemon, leaders who want to shift the paradigm must utilize highly sophisticated anchoring and linguistic stealth strategies.
The prime example cited is former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and his maneuvering around Article 9 of the Constitution.
Article 9 is the famous pacifist clause of the Japanese Constitution that technically, legally forbids Japan from maintaining land, sea, and air military forces.
For decades, the Overton window was locked rigidly on orthodox pacifism. Any political attempt to simply delete or repeal Article 9 was viewed as dangerously radical, a terrifying return to pre-war militarism.
Abe, who was a staunch nationalist, understood he couldn't act like a battering ram. He couldn't just propose deleting it.
So he used a nuanced anchoring strategy. He never officially proposed striking the pacifist clause. Instead, he proposed adding a new, seemingly benign clause that merely clarified the constitutional existence and legality of the self-defense forces, which, in reality, already existed as one of the most advanced, well-funded militaries in the world.
By making a smaller, ostensibly moderate demand just a clarification of reality, he managed to slowly inch the window away from strict theoretical pacifism without triggering the complete institutional immune response that a full repeal would have caused.
He picked the lock very, very slowly, millimeter by millimeter.
But there is an even more fascinating, almost Machiavellian tactic mentioned in the text, moving the window by changing the dictionary definition of a word, rather than trying to change public opinion on the policy itself.
The handling of immigration policy in Japan is a masterclass in this specific linguistic technique. Historically, the Japanese public and the political establishment have maintained a fierce, unified consensus that Japan is definitively not an immigration country.
That was the sensible stance, resting firmly in the center of the window. Openly proposing the mass importation of low-wage foreign labor to alter the demographics of the country was politically impossible.
But the powerful corporate business lobby was facing a demographic time bomb. The population is aging rapidly, the workforce is shrinking, and they desperately needed cheap foreign labor to keep the factories running and the convenience stores staffed.
So how did the government deliver this massive demographic shift without shattering the window and angering the voters?
They executed a brilliant sleight of hand. They simply redefined the terminology. The government aggressively expanded existing loopholes, like the Technical Intern Training Program. And in 2018, they passed significant amendments to the Immigration Control Act to introduce a new category called a Specified Skilled Worker Visa.
These policies resulted in a massive, unprecedented influx of foreign laborers into the Japanese economy. But, and this is the truly genius part of the maneuver, the government flatly, repeatedly refused to call these people immigrants.
Exactly. Even as hundreds of thousands of foreign workers arrived, the official government line remained staunchly, "We are not adopting an immigration policy."
They deliberately categorized these workers as interns, trainees, or foreign human resources.
By aggressively policing the vocabulary, they managed to import massive amounts of labor while technically keeping the stated policy of no immigration right where it always was, in the center of the window.
The physical reality of the country changed completely, but the theoretical window of discourse remained perfectly undisturbed intact.
It's a linguistic magic trick. You realize you don't actually have to endure the agonizing process of convincing the voters to accept a radical, unpopular policy if you can just convince them that the policy is actually something else entirely.
You change the label on the bottle, even if the poison inside is exactly what they said they didn't want to drink.
This brings us to a profound, overarching theoretical framework that ties all of these disparate threads together. The WIKIPIDIA text connects this immovability of the Japanese window to the work of the Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, specifically his theory of cultural hegemony.
We touched on this briefly before when discussing Owen Jones, but let's dive much deeper into the mechanics. How does Gramsci explain why a window gets so firmly locked that a society can't even see the bars of the cage?
Gramsci was trying to understand why the working classes in capitalist societies didn't inevitably revolt, as orthodox Marxism predicted. He concluded that a ruling class maintains power and control, not primarily through the threat of physical force or police violence, but by dominating the cultural institutions of a society.
He meant the media, the universities, the legal system, the religious institutions, the public schools.
If a ruling class can control these foundational institutions, they control the very ideas that are propagated to the public from birth.
They establish a cultural hegemony where their specific, self-serving values and economic interests are presented not as an ideology, but as universal, unquestionable common sense.
So the window stays fixed because the dominant ideology is literally embedded in the invisible infrastructure of society. It's in the history textbooks that children read, it's in the framing of the evening news broadcasts, it's in the underlying assumptions of the legal jurisprudence.
The ideology becomes the water the fish swims in. The fish doesn't know it's wet. If we apply this to the Japanese example, if the U.S. occupation forces and subsequent Allied administrations helped shape and fund those post-war educational and media institutions, then the ideas that served the U.S.-Japan alliance became deeply embedded as Japanese common sense.
To reclaim the window, Gramsci argued, a marginalized group cannot simply hope to win a single election. A political victory is meaningless if the culture remains hostile.
Instead, they must engage in what he termed a war of position, or a long march through the institutions.
You can't just storm the castle. You have to slowly, methodically take back the university departments. You have to fund your own media networks, create your own think tanks, elect your own local school board members, and slowly rewrite the common sense of the culture from the ground up over generations.
You have to replace their lock on the window with your own lock.
It is a grueling, multi-generational struggle. It is exactly the structural process that Owen Jones accused the neoliberal vanguard of successfully executing over the last 40 years to lock the economic window.
And it is the exact process that the WIKIPIDIA author implies Japanese conservatives, or any sovereign nationalist movement, must patiently undertake if they ever wish to reclaim their national sovereignty and shift their window.
I want to ask you, the listener, to pause and ponder something deeply personal based on this concept of cultural hegemony. Think about the political beliefs that you hold most dear.
The core principles you consider to be absolute, unquestionable, fundamental common sense. The ideas you would defend at a dinner party.
Are those policies actually your own organically derived ideas? Are they even your own culture's ideas? Or is it possible they were meticulously installed in your society's educational and media institutions by an outside power or an elite corporate class decades before you were even born, specifically to ensure you would think they were your own?
It is a deeply uncomfortable, unsettling question. We all desperately want to believe we are fiercely independent freethinkers, rationally evaluating the menu of options presented to us.
We rarely stop to ask, who owns the printing press that printed the menu? Who funded the chef? And why certain perfectly viable dishes are permanently, inexplicably unavailable?
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's try to synthesize everything we've unpacked in this deep dive.
We've established that the Overton window is far more than just a passing descriptive term for public opinion polls. It is a vital, dynamic, mechanical tool for understanding how societal change is engineered.
We explored how the window can be slowly, methodically shifted over decades by think tanks and secondhand dealers and ideas who translate radical concepts into digestible formats and wait for exogenous crises to shatter the status quo.
We examined the aggressive left-wing critique, which argues the window is manipulated by a heavily funded vanguard of corporate elites who dominate the media to enforce a hypocritical system of socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor, deliberately cultivating a sense of public resignation.
We analyzed the right-wing realist perspective, which celebrates the populist politician as a necessary battering ram, a leader who refuses to be a passive weather vane and instead forces the window to shift through sheer political will, repetition, and confrontation with the media establishment.
And finally, we looked at the chilling reality of an installed window, using Japan as a profound case study of what happens when foreign hegemony and entrenched cultural institutions lock the boundaries of debate so tightly that a nation cannot even conceptualize its own sovereignty without resorting to linguistic stealth tricks and redefining dictionaries.
Ultimately, whether the window is shifted quietly by intellectuals, manipulated by wealthy elites, violently smashed by populists, or locked in place by hegemons, the Overton window dictates the strict reality of the political world you inhabit.
It defines the absolute boundaries of your political imagination.
But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought that builds on everything we've discussed today. Throughout this entire deep dive, we have talked about the Overton window. Singular.
Right. We talked about it as if there was only one grand window per country, one shared baseline of reality that the entire society operates within, a single universally recognized menu for the entire restaurant.
But think about your smartphone. Think about your social media feeds. Think about the hyper-advanced algorithms that silently curate every piece of news, every political opinion, and every video you consume on a daily basis.
In an era of impenetrable algorithmic echo chambers, where you are only ever shown content that is perfectly mathematically tailored to reinforce your exact pre-existing beliefs, does a single, unified Overton window even exist anymore?
That is a genuinely terrifying proposition for the future of democracy. Has the internet essentially shattered the grand national Overton window into millions of tiny, personalized, non-overlapping windows?
We might currently be living in a fragmented world where one person's absolute unthinkable is literally their next-door neighbor's boring common sense, and neither of them even knows the other person's window exists.
If we no longer share the same menu, how can we possibly expect to sit at the same table and govern a country together?
The fragmentation of reality itself. If the window is shattered into millions of pieces, the traditional mechanisms of moving it that we've discussed today, the think tanks, the media broadcasts, the battering rams, might no longer apply in the same way. The rules of political physics are changing.
Keep questioning the boundaries of the window in your own life. Question the menu you are being handed, whether it's handed to you by a politician, a corporate news network, or a black box algorithm on your phone. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
If you enjoyed this, smash the like button and hit subscribe so you never miss an upload. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next video.